we always work to record our structured conversations so that we can upload them to our YouTube site after. So thank you. Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon and welcome to today's structured conversation. My name is Dr. Carrie Klima and I will serve as the moderator today. On behalf of the SAL Professional Development Committee, I thank you for participating in today's structured conversation, and an extra special thank you to our guest speakers. A few logistics, we will be utilizing the chat as much as possible. So as you have any questions or comments, we encourage you to use that chat function to engage in the conversation. So to get started, today's session is effective learning, learning outcomes, incorporating states of mind into assessment practice. And we're very lucky to have our own professional development committee member, Dr. Vince Nix, and we have Misty Song here to present for us today. I'm going to read part of their bios. I did send the entire bio out in the email of the invitation as well as the website. So forgive me as I have cut down a little bit, but Vince Nix is an assistant professor of educational leadership for the Center of Doctoral Studies in the College of Education at Lamar University. Vince accepted a tenure track assistant position in January 2019, and Dr. Nix has worked in administrative roles, VP, or both academic and student affairs, interim president of community college most of his career, and has had extensive management and leadership experience in East Asia. He conducts mixed methods research situated in organizational institutionalism framework that draws from diverse academic fields, including anthropology, economics, education, management, leadership, political science, psychology, and sociology. His broad research interests are effective learning, transnational education, student retention, and organizational change and turnaround. So I think he's going to bring great expertise for our conversation today. And Misty is currently pursuing a doctoral degree in organizational leadership from Abilene Christian University. Ms. Song is originally from Kunming, Yunnan, China, and she earned 3 engineering and design degrees from different Chinese universities and eventually achieved the rank of senior engineer during a 20-year career in civil engineering. She contributed to a number of international projects working on expressways while specializing in retaining walls and environmental protection in mountainous regions. She utilized a formative assessment to guide these projects for rural development in China, and she noted that without qualitative data, feasibility studies were not accurately informing the project planning teams. So great real life experience of using assessment in the real world, right? And Misty has worked as a tutor and academic advisor, student services specialist, and served as an adjunct instructor for community and technical college in STEM coursework. And she most recently served as coordinator for tutoring and collaborative learning at Lamar University. And just to review our learning outcomes, the learning outcomes for today's session is that our participants will be able to differentiate the effective learning domain, weigh the practical considerations of effective learning outcomes assessment, challenge assumptions of cognitive-only learning outcomes assessment paradigm. And so I am happy to turn this over to our presenters to take us through the presentation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Klima. That was wonderful of you, and thanks for joining and moderating today. Welcome everybody who's here. I'm sorry about that. I was gonna do the learning outcomes next, so I'm gonna have that slide, but since those have already been done, we'll do background research framework, go over the nomenclature. We're gonna use some words maybe that are not familiar, the ways we use them are not so familiar. Look at affective learning and how we've assessed it. We had a classroom environment, and then look at formative assessment, the data analysis results. Then we'll have a discussion, and we hope when we've gone through this about 35, 40 minutes, we hope the rest of the time everybody would join in and we can have some rich discussion. Here are the learning outcomes. Sorry, I didn't had it in the wrong order there, Dr. Klima. So affect is a state of mind. It's a complex collection of emotions that together equal a state of mind. Attitudes are sometimes reflections of that state of mind, dispositions or reflections of an affect, but attitudes also may influence the solidification of an affect.
And emotions like positive or negative feelings, including reactions, judgments, and perceptions. And assessment, including the judgment, deciding the amount, value, quality, or importance of student learning. And values are something that motivate a person or an organization to act in certain ways. We generally see that values are reflected through individual or organizational behavior.
And so then evaluations are judging the worth of a program or another entity. It could be an academic course, could be a person, based on a series of assessments. In human resource development, training evaluations are broken down into levels, and we'll go over those later, which are somewhat analogous to assessments as we practice in higher education. And then we'll use phenomenology. That's a type of inquiry based on the premise that reality is constructed by individuals and it's not collectively understood, nor is it objectively agreed upon. And then the meaning-centered education is a part of a framework proposed by Kobiasik and Blessinger. It fits into a critical constructivist paradigm. So a really quick primer on learning, behaviorists said, show me the action, do what I want. We don't care what's in that black box that is your mind. Cognitivists then said, hey, we know the black box. We can tell you what's in your mind and we can show you what's there. Just learn what we tell you. Then constructivists said, we can tell you how the black box, your thoughts, and your actions fit together and interact. But now critical constructivists ask each of us individually, how do you think your black box and your actions fit together? And then, will you help us build a better, more inclusive understanding by adding your thoughts to our models? So in 2000, the Competency Standards Project, another approach to accreditation review, was published on the CHEA.org, Council for Higher Education Accreditation website. The project was sponsored by the National Center for Higher Education Management Systems, or NCHEMS. They recommended cognitive learning outcomes. And since then, cognitive learning outcomes have been critical components of accreditation. Accrediting agencies, and as a result, universities and colleges have since adopted cognitive learning outcomes for everything. Now, before that, Spady in 1994 had claimed that cognitive learning outcomes were not appropriate measures of values, beliefs, attitudes, or psychological states of mind. And even earlier than that, Piaget had observed that at no level and in no state, even in adults, are we able to find behaviors or states which are purely cognitive without affect, nor purely affective states without cognitive elements. However, despite numerous calls over decades of research to include all learning domains, education remains laser focused on cognitive learning outcomes. Now, here are some recent calls for incorporating affective learning. Kobiasik and Blessinger called for assessing learning outcomes across all domains, not only cognitive. Pekrin, Lindenberg, Garcia advocated further research that had potential to achieve a deeper understanding of how emotions play roles in classroom settings, thereby influencing learning and behavior. Kilgo et al. Said high impact practices should also change students' attitudes and affective states. Norris and Weiss called for additional transdisciplinary learning and assessment to include cognitive, affective, and kinesthetic outcomes. Zoll et al. Stressed concrete examples of assessing affective learning outcomes were needed. Hansen maintained that assessing the whole student would have to include affective learning outcomes such as growth, mindsets, social and emotional intelligences. Hundley et al., and this is a paraphrase, but it's a really good, I think, asserted that if higher education is hopeful to improve the future of humanity, we must not continue to confine ourselves to cognitive learning outcomes. Affective learning outcomes based on reflection and introspection must be integrated. And I promise you in a minute, Misty will take over, but affective learning is not easy to assess. Affective learning is intimately associated with the acquisition of professional values. And that comes from Dr. Rogers, who created the assessment tool that I will show you a little bit later. But Misty and I developed this mental model over the last decade or so based on research and our own practical experience in management and leadership. And in essence, I must make my behavioral requirements match other people's values or get them to incorporate my values into their existing values foundation. And you see, values is the core here. Everything that I do emanates from those values, but we've got all this other stuff going on between the time those get translated into behavior. And that's what we're focusing on right now with affective learning. So if I want you to appreciate diversity and you don't already value that, I either need to begin by introducing you to diversity you can handle, or I need to change the way you value diversity. Now, Misty, didn't you have some experience with something like this?
Yes, I can provide an example here. As the coordinator of tutoring center, I was delivering training constantly to student tutors in order to develop their competencies. So I structured the training sessions learning outcome using traditional Bloom's taxonomy. For example, some topics like active listening skills, it's relatively easier to structure and assess the learning outcomes. However, when I structure some topics such as diversity and inclusivity, I encountered some challenges. The training evaluation results indicated that a majority of tutors consider the training session was effective because they understood everything. However, when I observe their tutoring sessions, I perceived that some tutors still felt very uncomfortable to even start conversation with the diverse students. And the tutors told me they thought the training actually didn't help, even though they understood everything, because they didn't know how to apply what they heard in the training sessions. So I realized that the diversity and inclusivity had not become their own values. So my question here is, were the training sessions really effective, or did the learning outcomes really reflect the trainees' competencies? So we hope we could address these questions later in our discussion.
Thank you, Misty. So Krathwohl, Bloom, and Measure classified the emotionally driven, values-focused, affective domain of learning according to this progressive hierarchy we have shown here. But an affect serves as the mediator. Without being intentionally developed, affect is about as ineffective as a broken traffic light at a busy intersection. Anything is likely to occur. There are three categories of affect: constructive, positive, or contrary. That's from Aurora and Sharma in 2018. For example, a long-term contrary affect may lead to an affective disorder like depression. Aurora and Sharma suggested that a positive affect could be induced by influencing positive emotions. Now, today, we're more interested in a constructive affect, as we believe those are longer term and geared towards organizational and personal growth. We're all familiar with the original Bloom's cognitive domain taxonomy, and I'm not going to show that here, but the greatest contrast is at that top level there. The cognitive domain educational objective is a mental activity. Here, conversely, we are trying to get learners to a state of mind. In the original handbook from '64, Krathwohl and Bloom and Measure called this a collection of values or value sets. Now, this is the Griffith University Affective Learning Scale. I discovered this, and note that it has 7 points for rating the 6 levels of affective learning. So there's a continuing there between organization and characterization of values. So I discovered this scale in the midst of trying to create my own affective learning assessment tool. So I contacted Dr. Rogers after reading a few of his research papers. It's a phenomenal instrument that's already been validated, but it is not open source. And I had to have a Zoom interview with him. He's down under in Victoria before getting permission to use the instrument. I agreed for non-disclosure, but this is I've got permission to show this. If you're interested in this scale, I totally recommend it. He has a full-blown rubric that corresponds to each level of affective learning. To collect evidence of affective learning, though, we need to employ a method of analysis that enables us to interpret participants' reflective accounts of their learning experiences. Back to phenomenology. Phenomenology is a philosophy and a broad group of analytical methods derived from the work of Edmund Husserl, but it analyzes perceived experiences as experienced by the people earning the experience. That comes from Smith in 2013. So we have to look at the way the learners describe making sense of or meaning from the learning activities. Then at the next level, we have to try to make sense of those learners' meaning makings as researchers or assessors. So we're operating under the meaning-centered education, meaning-centered learning framework, because that's a phenomenological, critical constructivist framework. And we are looking as learners center their meanings on professional identities and organizational tasks. We are analyzing their realities. And so I'm going to show you what we did in our online classroom, and then Misty will then talk about some things that they've done in the tutoring center. So we collected quantitative data from level 1 evaluations. That's over here on the top left. These are from Kirkpatrick's evaluation framework, and they were recommended by Simonson et al. For use in distance education. And I teach in an online doctoral program. And so I'm always trying to make it more engaging and do more to learn what's going on. We had a new course that we designed and put into the curriculum called strategic planning. It's the first time anybody in our program had taken such a course, and it was designed based on the administrators from the Texas Education Agency saying, here's what people need to know. So we've been working in human resource development. We knew these evaluation levels, but level 1 evaluations measure reaction to the learning event, the course materials, or the perceived likability or effectiveness of the trainer. We all do these. Every time we offer any sort of training, those smiley sheets and immediate reaction sheets, those are level 1 evaluations in an HRD framework. So then we made ordered response items, sort of a Likert type, but not, because we only had 4, but strongly disagree to strongly agree for each of these statements. So that was our level 1 evaluation. And that's not, we didn't think it was important, but it turns out it was. Then the level 2 evaluations, however, those are direct evidence. Level 1 evaluations are indirect evidence. Level 2 evaluations, that's where the reflections, the deeper reflections of the students, the learners, the respondents, they offer us direct evidence of their learning. They're reflecting on how they're going to use that and what they're going to do with it. And so again, those are the 5 levels, but on the bottom, these are the prompts that each of our students in this course had to answer every week. We did formative assessments every week because it was a brand new course. We wanted to pay attention to how the students were getting the material or not. And we had affective learning outcomes in the course. So here, we talked about emotions briefly. I'm not going to go into emotional theory, but I put a lot of recommended readings at the end on the final slide so you can see what this is. But basically, there are 11 to 13 emotions that researchers have said, oh, these are important. There's probably 5 to 7 that stunt or facilitate learning greatly. Now, most of those have been about cognitive learning or some psychomotor learning. There's not been very much attention paid to affective learning over the years. When we coded the data, we looked at their reflections and we looked at what they were saying, and we looked for emotional responses. We saw 8 primary emotions. We saw anger, apathy, anxiety, worry, confusion, contentment, happiness, joy, and satisfaction. And there may have been more than one emotion sometimes coded, but we looked at the primary emotion, and if there was more than one, the frequency, and we just used a primary emotion. So this just shows you how many segments of text we coded with that sort of emotional response. Then we looked at attitudes, and we used Katz's 1960 functional attitude theory. There's been a couple of other theories developed over the years, and I put references to those at the end also. But Katz is a classic theory. Everybody's used it. There's been one more category proposed by 2 or 3 different researchers over the years. But basically, these are the 4 functional categories of attitudes, and it stood the test of time. So we used these. Basically, we didn't think it was going to show anything, but it was sort of a control variable, a covariant at best. So when we coded those reflective pieces, we saw these sorts of attitudes: ego defensive, knowledge, utilitarian, and value expressive. And to be honest, I thought these are students, doctoral students alike, everybody's going to have a knowledge attitude. That's not what we saw. So then we looked at affective learning outcomes, and we rated those with the Gwal's scale that I showed you the header for earlier. So that Gwal score of 1 was no evidence, right? 7 is the top level. That's how many we saw in those 388 responses over one 7-week course. These are the scores that we assigned to those reflective pieces for affective learning. So if I had, you see 88 there, that means I thought 88 of those prompts, and several of us evaluated those, 88 of those reflective pieces met the learning outcome of characterized organizations through strategic planning constructs. There may have been evidence of lower level affective learning, and that's what the others were. But only 88 instances we met the very top level, see? Now, we had 2 researchers independently coding these, and the Fleiss kappa was 0.93. To get there, though, I'll tell you what we did. We first coded 0s and 1s to see evidence of affective learning, and our inter-rater reliability was only 0.82 on that. So we had another meeting, talked about affective learning, talked about the scale, then we used the scale. But in Rogers, the folks that have created the scale, in their research, they also have really high inter-rater reliability scores on all of their published research. So we think this is a really good instrument. So what did we find? Well, we found that attitudes were a significant predictor of affective learning. And you can see knowledge and value expressive were the primary predictors of meeting affective learning outcomes. Now, there weren't many value expressive outcomes. The only reason I'm really showing those and that they were significant is because it's interesting. All of those responses came from K-12 middle school teachers. So that makes sense. That population would really, you would hope that they have solid values foundations and that those were expressed when they talk about what they're learning. Now, what's important though is ego defensive attitudes function as an extreme barrier to achieving affective learning outcomes. Utilitarian attitudes also, but not as strong. Emotions we saw were significant. Contentment was the strongest catalyst for learning. Anxiety and worry was the strongest barrier to learning. So we were looking at this, we didn't analyze this level of statistical detail until the end of the course, but we were watching every week what we coded and what was happening. Also, for the level 1 evaluations, we were looking at those responses each week. And we had some people saying, well, I don't understand this instruction. So we tracked all of that for the whole time. And that made a huge difference. That was the only thing from the level 1 evaluation. But if students perceived that the instructions were clear, they learned. They met our affective learning outcomes. If they didn't, they did not. And so this is the only thing that we can control as trainers, as student development professionals, as classroom or online face-to-face online teachers. This is probably the only thing out of this, all of this that we can control, is to write or say or speak clear instructions. And what follow-up interviews said was not just general prompts, give us details so we understand what we're doing. And as we transition to the next slide, I want to stress again, this is not an easy process, including affective learning assessment. There are many psychological constructs that go into forming states of mind. And later, when Misty goes over some of the transitional assessments we might consider as we move forward, remember that Duckworth found in her research on grit as a construct was responsible for as much as 4% of the variance of success. That still leaves 96% of all of this stuff that's going on in our heads. Now, I wanted to show you, just to give you an idea of what we were looking at as instructors as we saw this. So we were meeting, it was a brand new course. That's why we did weekly formative assessments and assessed them every week. We saw negative emotional responses rather than reflecting on learning. And that concerned us. And we said, what's going on? Why is this happening? So after 3 weeks, you can see anxiety and worry was the main thing we were coding for. And the affective learning, characterization of organizations, that was almost nowhere to be found. It was buried deep down in the bottom. So we asked students, we talked to them, we met with the K-12 experts again, because the people who were responding negatively with negative emotions, those were basically K-12 practitioners. Our program is about 80% K-12. It's an educational leadership. The K-12 people, experts in Texas, said to us again, no, they need to know this. But when we talked to the students, they said, well, we have no idea why we need to know this. Nothing we do is matching what you're telling us. It's just stressing us out. So we listened and we adjust. We said, we can't have this much negative emotional response and reflections and think we're teaching students. There's no way that they're learning, and that's on us. So the 4 instructors got together. We restructured the rest of the course. We gave an extra 2 options for the culminating project outcome. And after we did that, this is what happened over the weeks 4 through 6. I didn't include week 7 because that's just a final project week. But as we can see, it's almost a tale of 2 courses. And so a plug here for meaning-centered education, meaning-centered learning. The gist of that is that we build knowledge as we go together. Teachers' instruction. We're reducing that power distance between instructor and learner. Anybody, that's what our goal is. So just side by side look at this. It was phenomenal, the change, but what we did was match strategic planning to their duties. And it was a lot of extra work, but then they learned, and it was a phenomenal change. But graduates from programs that have implemented affective learning outcomes, for example, pharmacy schools, nursing schools, they've been doing this for a few years. Communications schools are starting to do it. That should be of immediate concern for affective learning research studies, because level 3 and level 4 evaluations offer great potential for future research. Now, on the next slide, Misty's going to start talking, and she's going to show us some intermediate assessments and exercises and tasks that will generate constructive, probably some positive affects too, but mostly constructive affects.
So constructs such as intrinsic and extrinsic motivation and hope theory, resilience, self-leadership, and Clifton strength, character strengths, and emotional intelligence, impact, positive ratio, and mindsets, and spirituality, and grits. They all are related to and perhaps the key components of a constructive affect. We might want to consider developing those traits in our students too. Let's look at the positivity ratio, which is created by Dr. Barbara Fredrickson, and it helps students track their daily emotions and be aware their emotion states. Grit skill created by Dr. Angela Duckworth, and the result of the grit skill reflects how how passionate and perseverance students see themselves to be. And mindset quiz created by Dr. Carol Drake. It helps students perceive their mindsets, whether their mindsets fixed mindsets, or growth mindsets, or both. Optimism test helps students be aware their resilience level and understand whether they are able to quickly bounce back from an adversity. These are basic tools for assessing mindsets, or we call it success traits. And we know these traits are components of affects. So assessing these traits, by assessing those traits, we can see students' potential for positive or constructive affects. The assessment may also indicate risk levels of contrary affect. These may be students of concern. As I was helping Dr. Nix on this research project, I wondered how could affective learning outcomes resolve my issue with diversity and inclusivity training. By the way, this is not peer-reviewed research yet, but it's evidence from my practice as a student affairs professional. Last year, in our first diversity training session, we had 2 learning outcomes. First, understand what diversity means. Second, recognize the importance of diversity. These are pure cognitive learning outcomes. As I mentioned earlier, a majority tutors believe that they understood, and they also recognize the importance. But my observations made me believe otherwise. So the next semester, I held second diversity training, and I altered one of the learning outcomes to say, accept diversity as a bias mitigation strategy. This is a rearrangement of their value systems. I used reflective assessment, which is a level 2 evaluation questions after the training. For the qualitative feedback I received after the training, student tutors' comments include something like, some tutors said, I never realized I had such a strong bias before. Some also said, I thought I was quite inclusive, but this training helped me be self-aware I was actually not. Some tutor even specified, I assumed that somebody who wouldn't give a Christmas gift was just evil. I never considered that our Christmas traditions just might be less meaningful to a Muslim. I was so wrong before. These comments actually indicated these tutors have incorporated those values into their own. Their states of minds have changed already. Now, when I do tutoring training observations, I use this new training outcome, new affective learning training outcome to evaluate their performance. And I understand that this observation will be long-term.
Thanks for sharing that, Misty. That's incredibly interesting and meaningful. So now we would like to open it up for discussion, questions. I'm not sure if have been any questions in the chat box while we've been talking, but we want to have a discussion. Yes, we were on time, so please.
Yes, great job. Thank you both so much. So if you all have questions, you can chat them into the chat window, or feel free to also unmute yourself and we can hopefully have a conversation. So far, we just have some comments in the chat about that you all are presenting in the same location, which is, we think, a first for structured conversations, and a comment about the Kirkpatrick's model of evaluation. So just encouragement from our attendees. But yes, we do encourage you all to ask any questions or share any thoughts or perspectives or anything that maybe came up for you while you were listening or hearing about their work.
So full disclosure, we are a couple in more than research. We've been together for 15 years. and we're working from home like most everybody. And we just thought, oh, let's make it look like a fireside chat instead of pretending to be in separate locations.
have a question.
Hi, Joe.
Hi,
Hi.
Joe.
Hi, Dr. Levy.
Hello. Thanks for the presentation. So not that I would necessarily endorse this, but I could see some pushback on this from other folks, being perhaps that effective learning outcomes might be harder, in quotes, to measure. And so what response might you all have to that potential pushback?
Do you want to talk first? Do you want to?
You go ahead.
So they are, yes, absolutely. That's the whole, I think that's the one of the reasons, beside the NCHEMS study, that when accreditors said cognitive outcomes are the way to go, it's been pushback. I mean, Pasquarella wrote about this in 1985. I read this while I was a student affairs doctoral student. It's just been pushed back because it takes a lot of effort. But as Dr. Klima and I were talking about before the structured conversation went live, that's what we're supposed to be about. We're supposed to be about developing students and caring about making the world a better place. We didn't choose education to get rich. We didn't expect that's going to happen. What we expected was we're going to change people's lives. And we see what it's like to be led by valueless individuals. We need to start helping people solidify values. It is messy work. There's a lot of stuff involved in it. I mean, I can't tell you how many hours I have poured over emotions books just so I thought, really, is that important? It is, and you can expand attitudes too. I chose to be simple because I didn't think it was going to make that much difference. I was wrong. There are lots of attitude theories out there, but those things are important. And if we're saying we're educating and developing whole people, I think that's the new research article that I showed you. This one here, it's in these four right here, the 1, 2, 3, 4, Norris down to Hundley. Those are in one book. I'll show you the reference in a minute, but that paraphrase from right there, that's exactly why I think we need to care. But you're right, it's a lot of work. I'm going to show you that book because I've got it here, right here. And so we got this book because of the book club that is the AALHE. After the 2020 virtual conference was supposed to be in New Orleans, I got in a book club with a group of people, and this was the first book. And so I will tell you, I've been preaching affective learning for about 10 years and trying to get a faculty job. I had 4 job talks using this, and everybody looked at me like, well, why? So I know that it's not easy work, but this is the first time I've seen, since Pasquarella, people start to say, yes, this is important. So if you want to do research like I have to do, then this is going to be something that's mainstream coming up. But at some point, I think it's going to be forced on us. So maybe learn it while you can enjoy leisurely learning. But great point, Joe. I certainly do not disagree.
I have kind of a question that I've been thinking about, and as we wait for other folks to maybe chat in a question. I really appreciated how you introduced this conversation and thinking about on your slides in the beginning and the like nomenclature of this, and thinking about just knowledge creation and phenomenology and those perspectives. And I'm just curious, as I looked at your slides and I'm thinking through just the attitude section, right? And then the emotion section and clearance, like how do you see this work extending to explore various students' backgrounds that they bring with them, right? So like coming from different diverse populations, like have we seen that in the literature yet? Do we expect to go there in regards to having students from different cultural and racial and ethnic backgrounds, and how that maybe influences some of this?
Well, I think I think Renee did a session, or moderated a session on socially just assessment. And that we're talking about listening to students' stories, right? Letting them be the storytellers. And at its base, that's what phenomenology is. And so the meaning-centered education, meaning-centered learning framework from Kobiasek and Blessinger, that's what they're all about, is saying for a socially just education thing to happen, we've got to stop putting so much power between us and the learners. We have to learn together. We have to build this together. So if I don't give them seats at the table, I'm not doing justice. So I think affective learning, and I mean, of course, we don't have a gauge. We don't have a test to stick your finger in and say, I'm feeling happy today. But there are, one of the references, I think I put that on here, but I've got one that talks about facial recognition. That's a recent thing. AI is starting to be able to pretty well determine emotions when people walk through a scanner. And so that, some of this will eventually get automated, I know, but it's just going to be messy work. But I think your original intent was for me to say, yes, we have to listen to everybody to make this work.
Yeah.
And
I think that's where I was coming from. I'm just trying to think about the various perspectives and ensuring that all of those are included and not just the dominant ideas. And I think that's what I was hearing from the presentation as well. I do have a question.
And I would really, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, what I would really like to see is somebody use that CATS's framework to see if it makes a difference on cognitive learning, because I never expected utilitarian attitude to have a negative, be a barrier for learning. And it may only be a barrier for affective learning. I don't know, but this was, and this is peer-reviewed research. What I'm talking about, the half about the classroom stuff, but I don't know how we would do that other than reflective pieces, because when students write, that's when the feelings come out.
Yes, I'm going to read a comment from Renee. So we classify these as psychosocial factors on our campus that contribute to a student's journey in higher education. By measuring these affective domains, we actually get more information on our students in order to better support and serve them. So I think that really gets at kind of what we're talking about here, and thinking about what you said in the ultimate goal of serving our students and helping them to have that learning, growth, and development experience. And I have another question, which I think is a great question for us to consider. What advice do you have for someone who wants to introduce the concept of affective assessment to my campus partners? Would it be different if they're early career practitioners?
Oh, that is an interesting
I know.
question.
Thank you, Kimberly. Great question.
Yeah, thank you, Kimberly. Great question. You want to? She's okay. So yeah, I think it would be different if you're early, because I think the earlier people come into something, the less they have to unlearn. And so I had to unlearn a lot of stuff about cognitive learning, and because I was a psychology major years ago when that's what we studied, behaviorism and cognitive psychology. And that made me look at this a little skeptical. I have some experience outside education, but there was a study in 1985, Edward de Bono, and it influenced businesses worldwide. It's called the 6 thinking hat model. And he said red hat, this is funny when I think about it now, he used red hats to represent emotions. And he said, emotional people are unbridled. You can't control them. We have to and it was like a negative thing. We don't want to do this. We have to squelch it. We have to control it. And that's what we've done, that in business, and then cognitive focus in education. So that's a lot to unlearn, is my point for bringing that in. So if it's experienced people, yeah, I would tell them, look at your outcomes. Look at the state of the country's in right now. What we're seeing is people are, they know how to do something, but they don't value people or value the context enough. It's just like we used to have more closer to full employment. We didn't need people working, but owners used to care about people, so they kept the jobs. Now they don't care about people, so they ship the jobs overseas. That's affect right there. They know what to do. They know how to do it, but they don't care about their fellow humans. And as educators, as a veteran educator, that's the one thing I've started doing more of, is caring about fellow humans. And so I think I would, I'd probably write a speech. You put me on the spot, but I would use rhetoric really heavily for those veterans.
Thank you. We have a couple more minutes if there's any other questions. Again, feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to, or just put your question or comment in the chat.
You want to speak to any of that? you have advice on how to implement these on campus? She's writing something for me to say.
Okay. Well, I think if there aren't any more questions or comments, I think you've left us all with a lot to think about, to really consider how we can apply this on our campuses. I think to Kimberly's point, thinking about how we are considering bringing this to our campus and getting buy-in, or helping others to understand the importance and benefit of affective learning measurement. And so we really thank you again for all of these reading recommendations, and we appreciate your time. So I'm going to wrap this up. And if you have, we'd like to conclude today's session. And again, thank you to Dr. Nix and Misty Song and the SAL Professional Development Committee in helping to bring us today's conversation. A recording of this and our materials will be provided. I will send that in an email today, and we will upload the recording to our YouTube site like we do each month. We are, just to give you some future casting, we have a structured conversation we are preparing for November that we are really excited to share with you. And it's going to be about assessment professionals' journeys from various racial and ethnic backgrounds, and sharing about their expertise and their journeys into the field and through the field of assessment. So we're excited, and so please keep a lookout for emails and announcements for that registration, for that conversation. It's going to be in November. And so thank you all for attending, and I'm going to stop the recording, but feel free to stay on if you have any questions for myself and or Vince and Misty.